Thank you. Let me see, where do I have my... Okay. Please, Connie, then you can spotlight me here as when I'm introducing. Dear friends, I guess there might be some more coming into this event. So I will anyway start the meeting. This is a webinar on the issue of NATO and its new strategy on climate issue, which can be described as they are using it as a geopolitical weapon. We will have a main keynote speak by Peter Wahl from Germany, who is in the Council of Attac Germany, the scientific council, and who has been looking at this issue also from the angle of European Union, where similar kind of policies now take place. Of course, we know that the kind of politics we see today is not necessarily all the time officially declared and stated, but in reality it takes place as we speak. And actually there was a meeting, NATO meeting this summer in June, where the main the main focus in this direction was actually decided and written down. So some details has been addressed in specific quotations, which will be discussed further on here and in special meetings. But it is not only visions that takes place. It is in reality, this is going on also in terms of specific policies. We think that this is an important issue and very hard, because we are used to de-link environment from peace issues. And it will take some time, we believe, until people are understanding the new quality in this. But we hope this can be a good first step. And by recording this meeting and publishing more material about it, both in longer articles, which some of them have been linked to in the Facebook event, but also in shorter versions. So this new policy, which is really challenge for both the environmental and peace movement, can be addressed. So my name, yes, to say it again, is Tord Björk from Friends of the Earth Sweden. I am the coordinator of the Friends of the Earth European Union Committee, and I'm also been active in the World Social Forum process on environment and peace issue. I'm a member of the International Council of the World Social Forum and some other networks. Now we are very happy to have Peter Wahl with us, and as a keynote speaker, he can take the time he wants and introduce himself. So welcome, Peter, from the Upper Rhine Valley. You have to open your mic. And Connie has to spotlight Peter Wahl as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Tord. I'm happy to discuss this issue with all of you. As far as my person is concerned, I was very much involved in the 70s and 80s peace movement in Germany, which was quite important at that time. It was the time of the Pershing II and SS-20 campaign. The elder among you will perhaps remember. So then I was involved later on in after the end of the Cold War and the issues of peace and war were slightly down on the agenda, I was very much involved in globalization issues. I was one of the founders of Attac Germany. But in recent times, I have made a comeback, so to say, to an issue which I was involved very much in, as I told you, in the 70s and the 80s. I am dealing with these issues, by the way, from the times of my studies. I wrote my master in political sciences on disengagement between Warsaw Pact and NATO about the so-called Rapatsky Plan. So this was in the early 70s when this Rapatsky Plan was relevant, and I was writing about that and researching on that in the 70s. So just to tell you my background, why I'm dealing with these issues, and so let's go in medias res. The linkage between environment and climate on the one hand and conflict, war and peace questions on the other side can be analyzed in 3 dimensions. Out of these 3 dimensions, 2 are very well known. They are existing since a long time, and of course they are very important, whereas the 3rd dimension is quite fresh and a new aspect. I will go through these 3 dimensions with a focus, of course, on the last and 3rd one, but I will mention the 2nd and the 1st one. And to come to the 1st one, it is clear that environmental damages, be it through a natural disaster or through human activities, can create deep existing conflicts or create new conflicts. Famous examples, probably since the Stone Ages, is the question of access to water, to food, and to other resources. But coming to our times, there are quite some examples where you can see the impact of this 1st dimension, that environmental damages create conflicts or are deepening existing ones. Between Ethiopia and Egypt, there is a situation of strong tensions because Ethiopia is building and is almost finishing a dam on the Blue Nile. And as you know, that Egypt since 5,000 years is dependent on the waters of the Nile. This means that this is in fact an important conflict issue. Another example from our times, Brahmaputra, also a very important river, which provides water supply for eastern India. And but the first part of the Brahmaputra is like the upper Rhine, so to say, is in China and the Himalaya, and China is also planning to build a dam there. So of course, this is a point that creates some concerns to India, and given the entire context that there are already some other conflicts between India and China, you can imagine that such new issue is increasing the tensions. I could quote dozens of other examples, the Jordan River, for instance, and the conflict between Palestine and Israeli and many others. It's not only water, it's also the loss of arable land, desertification as a result of climate warming, or the other side, rising waters, rising sea level, which is a very dramatic threat, for instance, for small island states in our times, but also threatening the coastal areas of many, many other countries. So you see this first dimension. I will not go further into it because it's old, you know it. And what is important is that NATO too, and not only NATO, also other green books and strategy papers and so on dealing with the security issues are highlighting more and more this issue that climate change and environmental damages can create new configurations of conflict. The consequences, of course, also are very severe. If there is a struggle for survival, if you have no water, you tend to be very radical in your reaction. Another very important issue is migration, that is, so to say, instigated by disasters, by environmental and climate change. So these are quite common issues, although I think that in the debate, in the climate movement, they are not really present. It's more, you can read more about it in NATO papers, in US Pentagon papers, etc., about these issues than in the climate movement. A second dimension of the linkage between environmental climate on the one hand and conflict, peace and war on the other side are, of course, the direct environmental effects of military, be it as a war or be it outside, well, if there is not yet a war. I mean, that's also a very old issue already in very old times. In ancient times, we have reports when during a war, wells have been poisoned, fields have been burnt down, and so on and so forth. So the environment has been affected since many times through war effects. And a very relatively recent example is, for instance, the poisonment in Vietnam through the air war of the United States, which has created a lot of suffering for people and damaging also nature in Vietnam. Be it by intention or as a collateral damage, this type of direct effect of armed conflict, I mean, is very obvious. But already in peace times, there is, of course, also an effect on climate and on environment. The armament needs resources. If they make maneuvers, they use, of course, oil and other resources. So this is very obvious. And just to give you a figure, the United States Army has an environmental impact, in particular CO2 emissions, that is equal of countries, for instance, like Portugal, or the only United States Army. So you can see that there is another dimension of this linkage between climate, environment, conflict, and peace and war. The NATO plans, and maybe some has looked on the document that Tord has sent around about this NATO strategy, is very much dealing with these issues, and the NATO wants to become, to put it in a sharp way, they want to become green. Yeah? If you kill people, you do it environmentally friendly. So these are the two traditionally important issues of the linkage. And now I come to the one in which I am interested in recent times, because it is new and it is historically quite unique in my view. And it is using climate policies in our times for geopolitical purposes. What does it mean? I give you a quote from an article that has been written by the Foreign Commissioner of the EU, Borrell, and his colleague Timmermans. I quote from German, sorry. The exit from the fossil resources will improve considerably the strategic position of the EU. The energetical transition will lose to changes in the balance of power, away from those which control the fossil resources and export them, towards those which dominate the future green technologies. And then they add that the end of energy imports into the EU will contribute also that the income and the geopolitical power of countries like Russia will decrease. End of the quote. So this shows a type of thinking. And to add another person, another testimony, Joe Biden has said on the same issue towards the Chinese. They will not win this race. We cannot accept it, and we must take over the world markets for strategic resources. So you see, the resource issue is here in the heart of the problem. But it is not only the resource question, which also has always been one of the core problems of war and peace. There are additional elements that are introduced now into the climate policies. The EU is considering, for instance, a unilateral border tax, a kind of protectionism against carbon leakage, as they call it. And this is a plan. It is not yet implemented and decided, but the plan is there from Brussels. And it wants to tax unilaterally certain products to protect the EU industries against foreign competition. The problem here is not that you try to develop instruments in order to decrease carbon emissions. The problem is that you do it unilaterally, that you against what you normally say, that you want multilateralism. The EU is always talking about multilateralism and is talking about rule-based international system. Here they are taking unilateral border taxes as an instrument. Another instrument, very pertinent, of course, are sanctions and boycott activities against countries for whatever reasons. But these sanctions very often have also an environmental or climate dimension. First of all, they are spoiling the international relationship. Secondly, they are absorbing potential of the target countries. If countries like Russia or China or others are suffering, Iran is a case, are suffering economically from sanctions, of course, their space to maneuver, to use their money and their resources for climate protection measures, of course, is diminishing. And it is, of course, an illusion to believe that this is only a problem for the target country, because we know it, everybody, CO2 doesn't know borders. It has negative effects on multilateralism and rule-based international order. There's also the risk that there are countermeasures. And of course, if it is between the big powers, the global south and smaller countries are suffering too, without being capable to influence this power game between the big powers. So you see that these instruments that they are using have a dimension on climate and environmental policy which is negative. Also, an instrument is the competition and the protectionism with technologies. some of them being important for environmentally friendly new technologies, including some digital technologies which might be helpful in order to master climate change. So this is another instrument there. As a result of all this, we will have, if this is not stopped, a negative impact on climate change. It will increase the problems. Of course, it's true that the exit from carbon energy leads to a change in production, in processing and exporting of resources. There will be changes, in some cases, maybe even dramatic changes in supply chains. However, it is a big illusion to believe that countries like China and Russia will lose geopolitical power because they are losing the carbon-based resources like gas, coal, and so on. Because these countries are so big and dispose of such a large range of resources that they are capable to switch over to other ones. So it is an illusion if Borrell and others believe that the EU will improve its geopolitical strategic situation if there is a change in resource supply and supply changes. One example that is quite interesting is Aramco. Aramco is the biggest oil firm. It's state-owned by the feudal regime in Saudi Arabia. And if you look at their plans, which are now in the phase of being implemented, they use the money they have from the oil production to build tremendous photovoltaic areas in Saudi Arabia, which is very appropriate for that. There is a lot of space. There are no people living in these deserts. And there is a lot of sunshine, of course. And with the climate change, with warming, there is even more sunshine. And they will build then electric transfer lines to the coastal harbor, where they, and this is the plan, want to build big factories to produce hydrogen, and then they will export. They can export this hydrogen, be it through tankers or be it through pipelines. And the same is true for China and for Russia and some others that might be concerned by the midterm, and because short term, of course, gas will still be there, and if it is only as a kind of bridge resource, but it will be there on the next 10-15 years. Phasing out will only come in the 40s probably. So nevertheless, these countries will be capable to replace it by others, by other resources, because in particular, the new environmentally friendly technologies, electric engines, all these wind power engines and photovoltaic and so on and so forth, they need their own resources, and among them so-called critical resources. Critical means that they are highly concentrated in some countries, in relatively few countries, and among them you find copper, you find cobalt, you find lithium and rare earths. And if you now look at the maps where these resources are distributed, there are of course some countries very easy access to Australia, some even in the United States, and even in Germany, in the upper Rhine Valley, you have some lithium, and they are now prospecting to use it. But big countries still remain for these resources, China, Russia, and others. So also from that point of view, it is quite silly from the side of the EU, the West, and NATO to believe that they could use the climate policy as an arm, as a weapon in the new Cold War, and it will only create new obstacles to combat climate change instead of helping it. And what I see, and this is my last point for this short introductory input, it will not be possible. I mean, it will not be possible to reach the targets anyhow. That's another issue. But until 2050. But anyhow, the obstacles and the problems in reaching targets, even if it is later and even it is not 1.5 but 1.9 or 9 or 2.2 degrees, even then this will be even more difficult to reach if confrontation and Cold War continues. What is needed in order to master the climate and the environmental crisis is cooperation, is peaceful coexistence. And my final sentence here is the climate movement, including Greta Thunberg, will have to understand that if they want to be successful and effective. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Peter, for this very systematic and useful introduction to our discussion. We have invited two people especially for making comments, but do hope also that we can elaborate further with all the participants later. First, I will invite Ellie Cijvat, who is active in the Farmer and the Indigenous Committee of Friends of the Earth in Sweden, actually the coordinator, and former also chairperson of Friends of the Earth Sweden and several other things. You can introduce yourself and give some comments to this, continue the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Tord, for inviting me, and thanks, Peter, for the very interesting introduction to the topic. Yeah, my name is Ellie, and I'm, amongst others, former chair of the Friends of the Earth in Sweden, and currently active in the Farmers and Indigenous Peoples Working Group in Friends of the Earth in Sweden. One of the issues that I came to think of listening to the presentation was about the climate or the carbon border adaptation mechanism, or what it's called, the border tax, to put it simply. I think it is a bit of a tricky issue. I'm one of the persons who has always said we need to put requirements on importing products. It's if you look at the national sentiments in countries and the pressure that is being put on farmers, for instance, to adapt to legislation, for instance, in Sweden, where Sweden has quite high demands on their farmers. They're exposed to imports that totally cancel out their possibilities to work. So I would actually say that I'm positive towards such a border tax in that respect. It creates a better platform for the farmers in here, in the country itself to work. However, I also see the point of militarization and the escalating conflicts that we see, and the militarization trends, and the fact that is very worrisome for future global cooperation and actually working together on tackling the climate issue. So it's a little bit of a two-edged sword that I see. But interesting to reflect upon. I think what is an important issue to discuss further is public awareness. I mean, I think the general audience is not really aware of militarization, of NATO presence in the Mediterranean for stopping climate refugees, or ordinary refugees, if you put it that way. What are the plans of NATO? Are they working towards militarization, further militarization of the borders? What will happen in Poland with the increased conflicts, where refugees are used basically as a political tool to gain profit by some countries? It's a very cynical world we live in, and I think the public awareness could be increased in that sense. I think I stop here, and I leave the floor to the audience and to Lars, and maybe I can come with another contribution later on, depending on the discussion.
Thank you, Ellie. And then we will leave the word to Lars Drake, who is the chair of No to NATO in Sweden. You can introduce yourself further, Lars.
Okay, I'm very sorry I can't get the camera to work, and I'm in the countryside place quite far away. I also have some problems with the link.
But we hear you
thank
well,
you very much for. You can hear me, yeah.
Yes, very well.
Thank you very much. Okay, I should say something more about myself. I have been a resource and environmental economist for about 30 years. So that's what most of what I'm doing. I've worked for the government and for universities. And I've also been involved in the environmental movement in Sweden, in another part than Ellie and Tord, anyway. And thank you very much, Peter and Ellie. Interesting things, I think. And as I see the guys who are have United States as the leader, they have made a decision already about strategy, and in order to get their interest through, sort of, they had to demonize the enemy, and the enemy is China and Russia and a few other countries. They are, and it's very important for them to mobilize support for the existing power distribution, and also, which is part of that, to continue with the type of market economy that we have globally and in many of these countries. And one of the central organizations in this is Atlantic Council. And there is also, I think, one interesting person there, Ben Nimmo. He has been officer at NATO. He has been part and worked for Institute of Statecraft and Governance and Integrity Initiative, and he's now working for Atlantic Council. And in that work, Atlantic Council has a very important role with Ben Nimmo at the central part about disinformation, fighting against disinformation, as they say, which is actually criticizing what Russia has to say. So this is, I think, a very important organization. They've also been involved in propaganda games in Sweden and are sort of infiltrating organizations in Sweden. And I would like to quote what is on the very first page of Atlantic Council's homepage. Driven by our mission of shaping the global future together, the Atlantic Council is a non-partisan organization that galvanizes US leadership and engagement in the world. So that's what it's about. And this organization is very important, has had a lot of...
Now we don't hear you anymore, Lars. There's some problem with the connection. We heard you well in the beginning, but it became less and less good. But that's the problem living in the countryside in Sweden. It was great to have you with us for a while. Anyway, I might add some precise quotes from NATO. And it is so that at the summit in June in Brussels, they did formulate an official policy on climate. And they say that the alliance has a role to play in comprehensive response to climate change. This is a sort of key notion that means that they don't see their role as addressing the climate change as such. That is the role of the climate summits, COP meetings, etc. But they frame it in terms of security. And they see this role where they are becoming a sort of system administrator to help them a certain kind of ways of addressing this. I continue with the quote. NATO will strengthen exchanges with partner countries, as well as with international and regional organizations that are active on climate change and security issues, including the European Union, the United Nations, and others, where appropriate. NATO will also increase dialogue with civil society, academia, and industry on climate change and security issues to support its work and contribute to the global response to climate change. Here we see this very different way of addressing exactly what Peter addressed in the beginning here. It's not anymore an issue of addressing environmental issues as such. It's a way of addressing it as a system administration, where European Union is of special interest then to NATO. One can ask, one sees here also the tendency to claim that all the solutions has to come out of a dialogue with industry, civil society and academia. And this is what has been introduced since 1992 at the Rio conference, so-called Multi-Stakeholder Alliances. And this is specifically addressed as the solution at a meeting in the Swedish embassy in Washington, funded by the Swedish Civil Contingency Authority and were organized by Atlantic Council together with representatives of NATO, etc. What they specifically claim is that the solutions to the climate crisis is to be established by this combination of forces, meaning that we don't anymore should address it as a conflict issue. In this material from this meeting, you have the link in the Facebook thing, it's explicitly stated that what is needed for NATO and those who are close to NATO is a positive vision. And that positive vision is going to be a new social contract built on common values. With other words, what is the idea here is to involve the public in this new construction of positive values, and only for the West. The idea is to create green jobs, green investments in competition with other parts of the world who are somehow adversaries. And specifically small farmers are pointed at as a threat because they may lose their possibilities to survive, and then they will start new migration flows and become illegal migrants, which is, in other words, they are presented as a threat, not as a positive, something positive. So it's a very, very extreme, cynical world we are entering if these plans go into will be implemented, and they are already. We see it now, how migrants are presented as a weapon in a hybrid war at the Polish border here. So there is something really odd going on here in terms of claiming that the kind of solution to the climate crisis, which is opposed by, for instance, Via Campesina, the small farmers organizations globally, and Friends of the Earth and many others, that should be protected by NATO. And criticizing such solutions is labeled as a threat against stability, and has to be addressed as a security issue by these cooperation against foreign disinformation and those domestic forces who are promoting such a message. That is new for the environmental movement. It's a standard procedure for the peace movement. So I see a little bit hope here in terms of that a system starts to be so desperate that it even appoints the environmental movement as an enemy if they somehow address the climate issue as an issue that has to be solved in conflict with the corporations. So we have here a situation which is really a question of public awareness and educational efforts, but really hard as well, because what we have seen in when we have addressed this issue is that it's very hard for both the peace movement and the environmental movement to understand this new quality. And as Peter Wahl clearly addressed, the first two levels, that's very common to address it. But this new level is far more difficult. And when I'm making propaganda, I summarize what is happening in terms of that what NATO wants is to say that they defend democracy against authoritarian systems and values. And what I mean, what they're doing is pink washing rather than greenwashing. They present themselves as the carriers of liberal democracy and liberal values, European values. And that is these values, the common values they want to promote together with the richer nations. And the rest of the world, whether that is East or South, is sort of not really existing as anything else than a threat. And this is really a common concern for all in the environmental and peace movement, and actually in general for the popular movement. So that was my reading of some official text, which was also links to what happened. Now we do have time, and as we are few, that can also be seen as very useful. I changed now my view here to see you all at the same time. And you can raise your hand, as I suppose several of you by now knows the way of doing it on reactions. There you can raise your hand. Lars Drake has already raised his hand. And after you've done that and have been spoken, it's good that you lower your hand again, then I can see if there's new people on the way. And it's also good that one mute oneself when one is not talking. So please, Lars. Can you say what you want to say? Or is it you still that you are? No, no.
Now you can. Sorry about dropping out. I was thrown out. I would like to link up to or relate to what Tord just said about how they want to show themselves on the market, because I think to dominate the information space is very important for them who are trying this, I think, bad game. And they try to show themselves as very democratic and so on. And one of the things that this Atlantic Council that I mentioned has done is to come up with a declaration for freedom, prosperity, and peace. One of the points there is support the peaceful settlements of disputes, including civil conflicts, and refrain from the use of force, except if it is just and necessary to advance these principles. And that is this links up to, or this relates to the UN Charter. If you have that, you cannot go out and say we can use force when we want to if they are against our principles for how the world should be run. And that is very important. One thing they are using as an argument that comes back over and over again is that we are democratic and the other guys are authoritarian. And then if you go to this US Freedom House, you can see that they have divided the world into democratic and authoritarian. And in the list of 57 authoritarian, 42 of them have received money or weapons from the US. So it's actually 3/4 of those that are listed by this US organization are actually supported by the US. And then the most of the 15 remaining are sanctioned. So that's what I said about the need to demonize. You need to show that those guys are the bad guys and we are the good guys. And then when you look at it, it's actually a hypocrisy, double standards. I think it's one form of colonialism and the white man's burden and so on. So, but this is the power game they are running to make sure that the existing power distribution is not threatened. That's all what it's all about. And this the strategy concerning climate change is just one part of this whole game. And they want to have a Cold War with the bad guys on the other side to motivate their work and the kind of there's a lot of freedom, of course, but there's also suppression, and you can motivate a lot of rules and things that are not wanted by people because you have a greater threat to show on the side. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars, and you can lower your hand now.
I shall.
Not 100% for sure, but I think it's Nick, Angelica, and Peter in that order. And Nick, you from Transnational Institute, I suppose, which I would say is a very helpful organization for the popular movements globally. So, what is your...
Hi, Tord. Thanks very much for organizing. Can you hear me okay?
Very well.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much for organizing this, connecting these issues, because I think, as Peter and you both said, it's really critical that more people are paying attention to this interconnection. I want to make just three quick points. One, I very much agree with Peter about war causing environmental catastrophe, and we've seen that. I do question a bit more whether environment necessarily causes war, and I think we need to be much more cautious about those connections, because environmental crises and even scarcity can actually lead to better cooperation between people. They found this in many case studies, that actually kind of leads to greater cooperation. The problem is when the political systems use points of scarcity to cause conflict. And I think I've just make that point, that really, I think a lot of military strategies, especially NATO's and so on, make this point that climate change is going to cause crisis and conflict, and therefore you're going to need the military to step in to save the situation. And we really need to kind of tackle that framing head on. And I guess I just really reinforcing what many of you have already said, but I think what we're seeing is that security and militarization is becoming the default climate adaptation strategy for the richest countries. They're not doing enough to tackle a climate crisis. Where they are investing their resources is not tackling the climate crisis, but increasing military spending, increasing militarization of borders. It's effectively, we looked at, T and I did a report just before COP, which showed that the richest countries were spending more than twice as much on border and militarization than they are on climate finance. So they've not delivered the $100 billion they promised. They're putting that money into borders and militarization. So this is the climate adaptation strategy of the richest countries. And the last thing I wanted to throw out there was, I think it's really worth honing in on military emissions, because I think we need to show that NATO's goal of getting everyone to spend 2% of their GDP on defense is actually going to stop us tackling climate change. It's not compatible with a 1.5 degree role. As Peter said, and I think maybe Tord as well, we know that the Pentagon is a huge emitter of emissions. So every time we build a new jet, you're locking in emissions for about 30 years for much of this equipment. So increasing our military spending is not going to get us to our climate goals. So it's I think we need to, there's a big movement to have a campaign basically that 2% of GDP on defense is not compatible with 1.5 degrees, and encourage people to join up with that.
Thank you, Nick. That gave two very new dimensions actually to this, which I hope we can come back to in this, which starts to develop into a very ambitious public awareness effort, I hope. Angelica, I'm sorry, Clausen.
Yes, I'm representing IPPNW, International Physicians for the...
We don't hear you very well, but that is maybe not possible. Or if you get very close.
Is it better now?
Yes.
When I come very close to the microphone. I'm representing International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
You don't need to be totally so close. You're a little bit.
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also ICANN, and I'm the European representative of IPPNW, and I want to mention that we have to include the military dogma of NATO, that nuclear deterrence cannot, has to go on until eternity, it seems to me. And a lot of people are aware that this is stupid, and this will not help to fight the climate threat. And so it is really important that on one hand, we focus on military missions, as Nick Buxton said. And in Glasgow, there was a very nice transparent from Code Pink. War is not green. And I felt when I came back to Germany to talk with climate people and say them, war is not green. You have these dimensions that you can talk and discuss about war and what is war and if it's bloody and dirty, and that has nothing to do with climate change. And then the doors are much better open also to talk about nuclear weapons, and that we really, all our European states, because I'm here in Europe now, I say it, we have to sign the TPNW. Our governments have to sign the TPNW. So it's about connection of the different peace issues and the climate issues that will be very important now and in the future, and also to tackle NATO.
Thank you, Angelica. That also was new importance, that the whole dogma behind the NATO kind of approach to these issues is important to address as well. Peter, you wanted also to comment.
Yes, I wanted to comment an argument by Ellie, which she said that the border tax is a tricky thing. I fully agree, Ellie. This is a tricky thing, yeah? But nevertheless, I would say that in that case, there are some arguments to be against the border tax. I have been, during 20 or more years, always been fighting for protectionism, for environmental, human rights standards, labor standards, and so on in the WTO, in all these trade issues. Protectionism comes from the Latin word to protect something, yeah? And it is worthwhile, of course, to protect certain conquests in our societies against international, and I would say against neoliberal capitalist competition, profit-oriented. So here I'm fully on your side with that. I'm not advocating a neoliberal attitude towards protectionism. However, in that case, the problem is, I didn't say it, so I have to explain that. This carbon border issue is part of a broader complex, which is not just the simple trade competition between capitalist countries, is much more. It is one element in a much broader strategy of geopolitical power play. And this power play consists basically in the fact that the United States is trying to recreate, as it was during Cold War #1, a camp which is called the West or the free world or the democratic world, etc. Biden is now making in international conferences with possible partners. And the purpose of creating this camp, which is not yet there, but they are trying to build it up, is to stop the rise of China, first of all, and secondly, Russia as well. You know, we are in a situation where this process is not yet finished, but where it has started some years ago, and it's accelerating and it's sharpening more or less every day. And in this context, I would interpret the carbon tax according to what Borrell and Timmermans have said at the beginning, what I have quoted at the beginning, that as part of this strategy, I don't like it. I am against protecting, for instance, against genetic changed organisms between the United States and between the EU. These are capitalist competitors on equal footing. But the situation changes completely when it comes to the South, where the problem is that you have a basic asymmetry. These are not partners at an equal playing level field, but they are very different. They are rich here, and they have a lot of advantages, and they do not want the others. And the effect, even if they do not want, the side effect in any case is that the others cannot catch up with these instruments. And the same, of course, is with China and with Russia, that it is part of a configuration of this power play. And as part of the power play, I would say it's not fine. What they should do is, or what we should do as peace movement, is to promote cooperation and multilateral agreements on that. And giving, of course, space to pollute more for other countries than we are polluting. This is, by the way, the right to pollute for the global south is something that is accepted, I think, since Rio. There it is called the different responsibilities. So in this perspective, I would like to see my argument with the border tax, and I fully agree that it is a tricky thing and complicated to convey. Yeah, okay, for the moment being, that's enough.
Well, I saw Maria Mutt actually commenting on this, and maybe you, Ellie, wanted to make a comment directly before I have some comments myself.
No, just a quick reply. I'm glad we're on the same page, considering the globalization issues, Peter. I think, one of the issues with the carbon, the border tax, might actually be a matter of solidarity with whom, because, I mean, from what I see, I think I propose food sovereignty, for instance, also in the north, but also in the south. And that's not working towards an export market at first hand. So I think that's an additional dimension to the issue of the border tax question. Just an addition. I'll stop there.
Yeah, and maybe we all read Maria Mutt's comment in the chat, which was a little bit in the same direction as has been discussed here. It's a question of how actually this text is done, and note has what Peter talks about, the problems with asymmetric relations when the countries are on very unequal economic level. That's where really some problem starts. I think that what Nick, who unfortunately had to leave, as you maybe saw in the chat, addressed is really interesting, and we have been discussing this in Friends of the Earth Sweden when we got this information that it's actually wrong to claim in many cases. Maybe it was a study made by Transnational Institute or some others, looking more precisely into several conflicts, and that it was not really actually the climate that was the basic problem. So that is, and the reaction was, well, interesting. And I think this is the attitude we have to have in the environmental movement. The good thing with the environmental movement is that we are having a material condition to address. It's always possible to sort of look at what is the actual outcome of different policies or different systems. And then out of that, we can really discuss more neutrally what is actually the outcome. I see the big problem here is that in my view, it's quite obviously that in Sweden I have less problems, at least when it comes to physical existence, when being in opposition to my own government than they have in, let's say, Russia or several other countries. but that this system domestically is good does not mean that we can avoid the responsibility for what the Swedish state and the Swedish role in the world order. I remember when I came to India one time, and the big example of corruption was Bofors, the Swedish weapon export company. Often we are presented as they are corrupt, when in reality we are the ones who are corrupt on a very high level in the international system. And this seems to be a key issue, that the word is presented, and that is so very clear in these NATO discussions, that it's us who should be prevented and be optimistic and hopeful, and the others are a threat. And this, I would say, is a very peace movement issue. I think it's dangerous to only look at sort of material effects of the military, or that the resources can be used for something else. We have to also address that the whole way the world order is presented is a racist world order. When this presentation of what is happening is that a threat against us is created. And this has strong risks for what can happen in the future. There are strong tendencies of ecofascism in the environmental movement. I've been active for 50 years. And when I was a teenager, the solution was presented as necessary for the United States and Western countries to forcibly sterilize people in the third world. And this was a very clever kind of fascism, saying that, well, actually, the problem is rather that Americans are the ones who are really destroying the environmental, because every American is using much more environmental resources than people in India. But it's not practically possible to forcibly sterilize the Americans. So let's forcibly sterilize the people in India instead. It's a clear racist notion, but also very specifically claiming that the US unilaterally should force control of migration in the whole world. And this is exactly what is going on right now. This is precisely what is going on. The European Union, I was cycling through West Africa once, and there the borders were open. There was migration all the time to survive along the coastlines between the countries. But that is now controlled very much because the European Union forces through solutions of migration control. And we see in these texts by NATO, they all the time talk about the migration as some natural thing that develops by itself, when actually precisely what Peter talks about, these asymmetric economic relationships, which is made the main force, not the wars. Well, of course, they are also the result of these migration flows, but it certainly is also the economic structures. They are the ones who create it, and they are created due to specific policies. It's not the nature that creates it. And here we do have a danger in this whole way now that the system is integrating its work and saying that public, it's specific, private-public partnership is the solution for everything. And what is needed in these public-private partnership is that the private companies can protect their patent rights. It's utterly, it's a very sort of clear thing. And how can we then go beyond these first two levels that Peter talks about and see how we are now facing, I would say, a very weak system that cannot any longer maintain multilateralism, the idea of a universal, indivisible human rights, all these things that were actually main core of legitimation of UN and so on. And now we are facing a very, very much harder situation, but also hopeful, because now this means that environmental and peace movement have to work closer together with other popular movements. I see Peter Wahl raised your hand. Yeah.
Yeah, Tord, I have a technical question. Is it possible to load up a PowerPoint or a document from my side?
Yes, but then you have to be given by Connie the possibilities of doing that.
Yes, I think everyone has the possibility to make a screen share. On the bottom of your screen, you have a green
where?
And a sort of icon with an arrow pointing upwards. Share screen. You need to see the menu.
Yeah.
In the bottom
I tell you why. Because I have just 1 week ago made a lecture online with more than 80 people looking at it, which is called The Image of the Enemy in International Conflicts, and I have some very nice and interesting pictures there, which show exactly and point at the core of this problem that also Lars has mentioned, that you have an image of the enemy, and as the same coin, the other side of the same coin, an image of yourself, which creates, so to say, the psychological, political, ideological, and cultural engine of conflict. So if I would find it technically, it's really worthwhile, I'm sorry, but I don't find this.
If you want to show something on the screen, you have to check what is on your screen, because it's the whole screen you have will be shown to the meeting. So make sure you put what you really want to show as more or less the whole screen.
Yeah.
If you have the share screen, you have found the
It's like a button on the lower part. At the bottom edge of the Zoom window, you have a button called Share Screen, and it's green. Everyone else is sort of gray.
I see.
And you just push that one, and then you have to swap the window. And now we have what looks like a PowerPoint. Wow, this is going better and better. Thank you.
I mean, it's an animated PowerPoint, but I put it not here as an animated, so the pictures are popping up one after the other. But what you can see here is, in German, it's a very old phenomena, which dates back at least to the antiquity, where you had the difference between the barbarians and the civilized on the world on the right side. It went through the whole Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, with the Huns, the Mongols, and the Arabs, with the Turks before Vienna, and so on. And on the other side, you had the Christian Occident. Then you see here this very nice on the left from World War I, where you see the iconography of the enemy as a beast and something horrible on the one hand, and then attacking and taking a woman, a white woman, so you have also the racist element, if you want. And this is very old. It's an archaic type of picture that is created. And if you see this destroy this mad blood, you have the same thing later on with Russia. Here on the left side, you have the Russian bear in 1994. Then in 1940, is a picture with this animal, I don't know the English word, which is also very common in anti-Semitism, by the way. Here you have a continuity to, of course, the Nazis and the Bolshevik enemy. And here at the right, in after-war Germany, the Christian Democratic Party, the same thing. And then this continues in our times. Here you have the same thing, Putin as the brute animal, and here you have the woman which is in his grip and so on. So you have it in the picture, yeah? And it continues like that. And unless we do not understand the mechanisms of this type of enemy pictures and the reverse side, that we are the good ones and they are the bad ones, this mechanism has to be, well, destroyed is the wrong word. It has to be criticized, and we have to delegitimize it. Yeah? This is, in fact, a core issue of our peace endeavors. Unless we do not succeed, even progressive people then believe that they have to defend, because we are the good ones, what we have, our good things, against these bad ones. What we have to take is a third position. What we should not fall into the trap if we are criticizing our own camp, to switch over to the other camp, to become pro-Chinese or pro-Russian. This would be the wrong methodology. The right way to deal with this issue is to take a third position, a systemic position, which has as value the stable, cooperative world that is capable to solve the global problems together. This should be the departing point of such a systemic third point, which is not impartial. In some cases, it can be for the one side, and in other cases, it can be for the other side. But the basic approach is systemic third position in the interest of peace, cooperation, and solving the global problems of a globalized world.
Thank you. Now we welcome Emma Morrison, who just entered our meeting. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you. I'm cooking, so I won't put on my camera, but I will listen.
Okay, cooking is good. And Maria welcomes you as well, as far as I understand, and some have left us. We are into a very sort of continued discussion, so everybody is just can raise their hands if they want to ask something, and if you want to, we could maybe even sort of summarize a little bit after that. Lars and Ellie have been speaking, who have raised their hands. Lars. Well, the microphone is not on, Lars. We don't hear you and we can't see you.
I completely agree with Peter's view about the third point, rather than taking a stand with one or the other of the main partners or main actors on the power scene. We had this during the Cold War, when India, Tanzania, Austria, Sweden, and a few other countries said, we will not take their stand or the other side stand, not US and not Russia or China. We will go on a third road. And that was actually a very good way to reduce the tensions in the world, and I think that is absolutely what we should do, and we're trying to do that today in Sweden, at least some of us. Then one thing I want to comment on also is what Tord said about forced sterilization. I remember one of the things that engaged me in the early stages was actually to promote population control, sort of, in the world, and that, of course, that was in the third world mostly. I still believe that is a correct thing to do, but not forced sterilization. But when I was born, and compare that with today, we are 3 times as many people today than we were when I was born. So, and 3 times as many people implies that you have 3 times as much resource use and environmental impacts and so on. So this is part of the problem, and it should be part of the solution to do something about it. But it has to be done in a humanistic way. And part of it is kind of automatic. People are getting less children in the families today than before because the children survive. So this is partly automatic and partly something we should think about as part of solving environmental and resource issues. If you only walk on that line, we won't solve the problem, but it's part of the solution. But of course, the methods they were dealing with to have forced sterilization in poor countries and no efforts in their own countries, it's crazy method. It's like absolutely unacceptable. Yeah, that was all for now. Thank you.
Yeah, and Peter and Lars could maybe lower their hands now, because then the yellow hands disappear and now we have a white hand, or at least something like that. Yeah. People start to know these Zooms more and more, and that one can have different color of the hands and so on. Okay, Ellie.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Lars, for clarifying. In the end, I think it's very important to make our position very clear that this sort of new argument that we see more and more in social media forums, etc., about reducing population is actually quite a fascist tendency if you talk about people in the South only. And actually overall, if you put it in the wrong manner. And I think it's a bit concerning that this is coming up in environmental fora, etc. I think what is important, of course, and which I guess we all know here, is that of course it's a matter of the richest 10% that is using much of the resources and causing much of the emissions. But yes, yeah, I guess there's no need to specify that in this forum. I think it's a bit interesting about the third way, and I support that very much. But I also get like a cognitive, how do you say that, dissonance with Tony Blair and his third way. But that's another, yeah, strange association. I think what we could combine with the systemic aspect of the third way is a clear popular support, mutual support strategy between peoples all over the world. And I also there, I'm sure that's basically clear. But it's maybe something that could be expanded and be built upon more, trying to get a popular campaign for these issues. In that respect, I think also the asylum movement would be an interesting partner. And I'm active in the asylum movement as well. Because of course, militarization of borders and seeing migrants as hybrid attacks, as the Social Democrat minister said, is an affront to the asylum movement that builds on solidarity. So a popular campaign would be interesting, trying to gain more momentum. Thanks.
Well, I think it's very nice to have Jonathan and Emma with us. I've been traveling with train through north of Scotland once, even out to the islands. It was possible to go further down there for these wonderful railway lines. The only thing I didn't like was all these horrible castles, which show the sort of militaristic presence in the history, very different from Norway or the countries up here. We're very similar kind of a countryside, but shows some kind of different history there. Must have been a lot of repression to be able to build all these castles everywhere. And of course, you then submitted a lot of mercenaries to the Swedish king, who was paid by the French state to create war in Europe with helps of Scots. These kind of things are going on now as well. I see at interesting situation, because I've been very active now in the World Social Forum, where we were able to get together a broad range of movements to address the environmental issue. 40% of the speakers were young, but we did really have the trade unions with us, the farmers movement, the habitat, the movements of habitatants. We had all these who are working for local solutions, especially from the third world. And we had Friends of the Earth, we had the International Peace Bureau, we had the International Anti-Imperialists and so on. And it was possible, I think, partly because you don't need to start from scratch. As there is a World Social Forum declaration, meaning that those who are sort of not really critical towards neither the relation that we have to change the relationship between man and nature, or patriarchy, imperialism, and capitalism. You don't need to discuss with them, which makes it easier to go beyond the silo of environmental and climate movement, sort of. And now, when we are trying to organize the 50-year anniversary of the first Stockholm UN Conference on the Environment in 1972, when we really are trying to reach everyone. And then you are faced with the kind of perceptions people in common have about environment and climate. And God help, this is not easy. And this is actually the task we have ahead of us. We have to go beyond, more closed circles. Of course, we do have to try to develop more specialized things, which we are doing today. But how can we address these issues in such a way that it's relevant for the daily life of people? And here I see some interesting tendencies. There's quite a lot of movements with elderly people who are claiming that the young people are not with us anymore, etc. I don't understand this. It's true that young people are shifting issue very much quicker. It's true that they are quite often opportunistic. It's true that they are not so keen on establishing organizations that work continuously, etc., within the framework of the so-called new social movements, peace here, environment there, feminism there, etc., etc. But they are very interested in general political issues. And a key person now for the whole environmental space in next World Social Forum, who also was a key person this year in January when we organized it on digital, was an activist from Lithuania, from the United Against Racism. And the motivation was very simple. They said, the whole network, that, well, we've been engaged in these racist issues, migration issues, refugee issues, against hatred, etc. We find it also important with environmental issues. And it was not more complicated than that. But they certainly were enormously clever in addressing how to facilitate the whole event. They were clever in all the technical things, and also clever in not creating unnecessary polarization, all these things. So I don't think that young people are a problem. The problem is that one have to open the doors when one do things. And sometimes you have to, I don't think that young people necessarily are super interested in what we talk about precisely today, but they maybe are tomorrow. And what I see now is the possibility of further develop the intellectual work for several of these events. There's many events going on right now. The World Social Forum, what happens in Stockholm, plus 50. There will be a Palme Commission, the second Palme Commission presented in April about common security. There will be a common security meeting in Helsinki in 2025, which is really good for all these kind of linking refugee issues, environmental issues, peace issues, within the context of global solidarity. So there's a lot of things going on, and especially maybe in the Nordic countries. We had an Oslo webinar organized mainly by Grandmothers for Peace, you know, these 90-year-old ladies, and the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, together with Nature and Youth, young people in their 20s. And Friends of the Earth Norway and people in Russia on exchange between the Nordic countries and Russia on environmental and peace issues. And I think this is really hopeful if we can develop some kind of ideas of just transition and then link it to this issue of how to challenge these escalation of tensions and militarization, so that all of us can come out of our comfort zones, you know, CND, Friends of the Earth, etc., etc. But what we see in Sweden, and I would wonder how it is in Scotland, is that Friends of the Earth has a peace committee, and the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom in Sweden have an environmental committee. And they made a bike to this Women's International League of Peace and Freedom for environmental issues this summer. This kind of not especially grand, but kind of developing some smaller links where the kind of discussions we have right now might be very useful, because I see an extreme tension between those only focusing on anti-racism, refugee issues, and those mainly focusing on imperialism and US, etc., where we as more mainstream environmental and peace organizations might be able to bridge the gap between these two tendencies. Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah, I just, first of all, apologies for coming in late. I completely got the time, not thinking in myself about time changes. And ridiculously, I've been speaking to someone earlier in Europe and not making the connection with the link. Just to say, I think, I mean, definitely here, you know, there's quite a close link between different groups. And I think there's quite a you know, increasing kind of progressive movement, whether it's in terms of refugees, climate change, anti-war. You know, there's a lot of the same people involved, in fact, and it's cross-generational. I mean, interestingly here, you know, different in the UK, younger people are voting more progressively, much more progressively than old people are. So it's complete reverse to what you're saying. You know, it's mostly my age, which is 70 and above, that are writing very conservative and very reactionary stuff, and younger people are more progressive, particularly in terms of things like race, gender, and climate change and so on. They're possibly not so aware of class, those kind of issues, but they do kind of come together, I think. In fact, they are coming together increasingly because young people are poorer on the whole than older people. So the fact there's a different form of class change going on. But I mean, I do think, you know, if we're going to work on these things, we have to work, you know, both across countries. You know, I mean, obviously there are progressive movements in Russia and China, and you know, it's not, you know, and I think we've got to get away from. We are moving to this worrying time when there's kind of a build-up, particularly, say, from NATO towards China, particularly, but also Russia. And we shouldn't be doing it. It's madness, because basically what we should be dealing with is things like climate change. We have to work together. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be critical, but we should be equally critical about what might be going on in China as America, because when America has masses of people in prison, so do we here in Scotland. You know, I mean, this is a form of political imprisonment, whatever, you know, whatever you call it. So I think we somehow have to break down boundaries, but it's yeah, the largest problem, I think, is that there is a large part of the population who are very apathetic and disengaging with politics, and that's more of a worry, I think, than anything else. But there is, within that, there is a growing kind of progressive movement, but there is unfortunately a larger core of the community which is quite unprogressive, and will tend to take on this kind of nationalistic stuff and anti-refugee, and not even taking climate change seriously. That's a major concern, and we somehow have to get to those people. Anyway, that's my little saying hello to you, and pleased to meet you all. A friend of mine, Michael Rainsborough, sent me the link today and said he thought I might be interested. And I particularly organised things so I would be eating my lunch while I could listen to you all, and then missed it. And Emma's obviously come to, either passed it on to other people in our group, and Emma's obviously come to join it as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Please give your email in the chat so we can have.
Yes, surely.
Actually, Maria and Bo, you have been listening all the time. You maybe have some comment. Maria put it in the chat also, but do you have some comments?
No, I've been listening. It's very interesting. The questions are huge. My thumb up was for the third position. Yeah. So I think I don't know what I should put in, but the population question, I think it's very problematic that it's so polarized, because we should have put much more resources into supporting women and reproductive health. Matthias Wackernagel has said that the most effective way for sustainable development is the education of women. And it's so polarized that those that say that it's national anti-ethical to speak about population questions, they tend not to focus on the suffering from all the women, millions that are dying in bad circumstances when giving birth, and all the injuries and so on. So I think, and also when saying that it's only the rich world, but if we are really taking migration seriously, then I mean, then we shouldn't divide. I have never understood really that, because do people expect people to stay in poverty? And if not, then the population question is, of course, relevant. And it's not just the emissions, it's the biodiversity and everything coming with it. And I just, I can't find it now, but I read a very good book from an Italian geodemographer. It's called Our Shrinking Planet. And he's supportive of migration and everything like that, but he says that population question is central.
Yeah.
And I mean, for instance, in Nigeria, what I understand in this century, the growth of people, the population will grow with as many as the world population was in the 1950s. So it can't be polarized, these questions. And it's very sad that it is dealt with so badly in the past. But resources, immense resources for women education, because the patriarchal system is so much in the center and in the heart of the growth of population. And so many countries have working markets that isn't sufficient for all the people. And one has to put it also into the question of degrowth. And these are so complicated. So it's so bad that these questions are polarized and dealt with separately. Yeah. But I'm not so I'm used to read English, but not to speak. So it might have been a bit cryptical, but I hope I'm finished now. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. I see Lars and then Jonathan.
I agree with Maria here. Educating women in very central issues, sort of relating to this, is very, very important. And actually, when it comes to the reason why people die, poverty is one of the most important factors. There are a couple of diseases or types of sickness that you can have with the heart and the cardiac system and so on. But that's actually one of the most important. And also one other aspect of this is that once women get educated, they can avoid getting too many children. That's one factor. But the other factor is that they have a value on the labor market, and then the man in the house will not push for more children, probably because it's better that she works on the labor market. That's actually one factor. But another thing which Ellie brought up, sorry, I'm a little bit confused now. Yes, it was Ellie. It was about immigration, and also Tord brought this up. The control of immigration in Africa, but when it comes to the number of people who are coming as refugees to the EU countries, it is almost only, or a very large majority, comes from countries that have been bombed by the United States and the United States and their friends. So I think it's one good way to increase it, because once these people come to the EU borders, they should be treated in a humanistic way. There's no doubt about that. But the best thing is if they don't have a reason to run away and stay where they were born. And if somebody wants to move, of course, fine. I'm not against that. But this large quantities of people fleeing away from their countries, it's about bombing. It's about war created by these good guys in the West. And I think we have to link up and cooperate between the peace movement and the environmental movement. But these groups who are supporting refugees, I think, are also people who should be sort of integrated in the whole thing. So I agree with that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Jonathan.
Maybe he didn't.
Oh, sorry. Yes, no, I realized what you said. You said my name. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with the last speaker. I mean, I put something out today. It's got lots of likes on Facebook about, basically a cartoon with war and then refugees and the connection, and it's massive. And some people don't really get that. Some people are very concerned about refugees, but they don't seem to see the anti-war thing. I don't seem to make a connection somehow. But I think we have to try and do that. But to come to the population thing, I mean, I do think overpopulation is a problem, but the biggest problem is wealth. There's been massive change in wealth across the globe, and you know, even during the COVID period, there's been a huge increase in the number of billionaires and massive wealth accumulation by rich people, and I think the top 1% of people are meant to be responsible for 50% of the emissions, you know, or something ridiculous like that. You know, it's horrendous what's going on. So I do think we need to look at population. I agree about education, but the biggest problem is the wealth of particularly the top percent, but probably the top 10%, which probably includes most of the people here. You know, people have come to expect too much. You know, come to expect, like in my city, I'm just writing something for tomorrow. You know, people have come to expect to have 2 or 3 cars. You know, and all these kind of things have become normal, when in fact that they wouldn't have been normal 20, 30 years ago. And that means that wealth and the effect on climate are being, you know, they're both causing major problems. So it's kind of getting a balance on it. And I think it's wrong to say, sometimes when people say it's not population at all, because it is partly population that's a problem. But on the other hand, I think the biggest problem still is the ridiculous disparity in wealth. And it's been escalating completely out of control. We have a dysfunctional system completely. And that's obviously linked to climate change as well, because a lot of the money that people are making is out of the arms industry, out of oil and gas, all these things that are being destructive to our world. Yeah, I'll shut up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Lars?
I completely agree with Jonathan. I've said many times that environmental issues, climate change issues, war and peace can never be solved with this kind of inequality in the world. And that's you can't come around that issue. It has to be part of the solution. Thank you.
Okay, Bo.
Well, Tord, you asked for my opinion. And I have to say, like Maria said, I seldom use my English. It's not so very good in speaking, but I listen more. And I see me and Maria, we are in the same organization, the Swedish organization, the Social Democrat organization in Stockholm called Reformisterna. We have met each other before. Well, and I have to say that I try to affect the Swedish Democratic Party to be more, what to say, listen to more peace voices, like in the old times, like Olof Palme, if I say like that. Thank you very much.
Well, you do it really well as you became actually delegate to the party congress recently, and together with, was it 88 other social democrats, had this letter sent in one of the biggest papers. So, and you've been doing a lot of work for many years in Activists for Peace, who started this whole idea about peace on earth and peace with earth. And so you've really been a very important in this change now when we try to merge the movements in Sweden. But in general, I would say that I think I partially disagree. I do agree, Maria, when you say the problem with polarization on the general level, but not in the movements. I've been looking specifically on these activists from 41 third world countries who was invited to Stockholm like in 1972, who aggressively attacked the ecofascism presented by Paul Ehrlich, who had these ideas of forced sterilization, etc. And they are often accused for being attacking a scholar like this Paula Ehrlich, who was very known, and puppets of another American Barry Commoner, and actually they were not anything else than non-scholars, idiots, etc. Although they were professors, some of them, and they were researchers and activists. When reading their own papers, it's quite clear that they promote population control in the way that you, Maria, discussed as well. And I've never seen popular movements actually saying something else than that kind of attitude that a women's right approach to population issues is really central. But I do agree that there has been really at the top level this kind of problem. My problem then is that I find, and especially today, that people in the movements give a damn shit about the movement. They are much more occupied with the mass media, who are totally crazy, who are totally irrelevant for the discussions that are actually the important ones. For some reason, we have lost the integrity we had before when we established our own sort of culture and our own media, and are now much more in the hands of multinational US propaganda companies like Avas, all these Australian companies and so on, who mass produce click activism, where we are supposed to click a button and select only an opportunistic issue right now, and where we lose the coherence. And this is where it might be so, Jonathan, that young people are more radical in Scotland or Great Britain than in Sweden, because the crisis is not so hard yet in Sweden like in many other countries, although it's developing very quickly in Sweden as well. But I would say that there is a split. There is a definite split. And I don't at all agree with young people who focus on racism without linking to imperialism. I don't agree with them when they don't focus on the need to change the whole trade union, and especially the total corrupt financial system administrated by the worst fucking idiots on earth, British politicians, who claim that the whole system is transparent and are liars. And they are creating a mass destruction of this earth by corrupting, tax avoidance, drug money, etc., etc. And as long as young people don't go and say hell to these things, well, then I don't wait for them, because tomorrow they will come. This is why I'm sort of, I'm not interested in young people, I'm interested in politics. And I know that they will always come, and that there is a good tendency now with these races when it starts to develop into anti-colonialism. And anti-colonialism, which in Sweden also address the domestic colonialism. And then it starts to become interesting, because the older generations don't understand that we don't have much difference between domestic policies and foreign policies anymore. And this is the big mistake by the peace movement. They don't understand it. We have a lot of problems, Friends of the Earth in Sweden, trying to educate the peace movement on these issues. And when we addressed the Ukraine crisis, Friends of the Earth Sweden did this, people activists and Friends of the Earth, we said it's a social ecological crisis concerning the Black Earth. It's not only geopolitical. And we were thrown out of the anti-imperialist camp, and the pacifist camp didn't agree and didn't understand anything what we said. We said we are against austerity policy in Ukraine, EU, and the world. And we give a damn shit about if young people don't understand it. We give a damn shit about the old 70 years old ones in the peace movement, the pacifist movement, the anti-imperialist movement. We continue building such a movement which is linking the daily struggle of people in their local realities, the need for changing power relationships at every workplace against privatization from the local, national to the global level. And that's where we have to focus a little bit on exactly the points where this becomes clear and not have, there's too much praising ourselves, not understanding the crisis, for instance, very clearly in Friends of Stockholm, where suddenly China becomes a problem, or that we shouldn't be anti-racist because there are some idiots in the anti-racist movement that wants to throw down statues of our great scientist Linné, who of course wasn't so great, but anyway, the connections are really odd. Yes, we live in a world where people also in our movements are confused. There's a lack of focus and there's too much opportunism. And I would say that is the great opportunity for us, because it's the same with our enemies, or we are not opponents, like Gandhi would say. They are also utterly confused. And this is why they now desperately try to unite their forces and destroy every separation of issues and sort of merge everything into one multi-stakeholder hallelujah thing, sort of. And this is a new possibilities if we start to erase the boundaries between the movements. And then I think some young people are there already. Okay, Emma.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when we're talking about climate change, we do need to look, as Jonathan was saying, at wealth disparity, because it's all very easy to start blaming it on population problems, but that then you get into a really right-wing argument, because you're basically blaming the problem on black and brown people, and that's not the problem. They, in these areas of the world, they're hardly creating any carbon footprints because they don't have those technologies that we have. So I just wanted to put that in. But I've got to run back to the oven now, so I'll switch off again.
Well, that was a very important point. And it's, oh, Maria, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, but yeah, I just want to respond that, of course, it's like that now. But do you mean that they should stay in poverty? This is the gap, the link that I have never understood when people say, I know that 10% is emitting 45% in the world or something like that. But the emissions, even when the population of the world was 1 billion, we were extinction. There were extinctions of other living beings. So it ought to be, and also, I mean, with the climate change and the change of the ecosystems, capacity to produce food and so on, it will be so much harder to make this transition without chaos, even if we are making our society much more equal and reduce richness and so on. So I think, and the question, do you really mean they should stay in this? And I feel so sad, because it's so much a part of the patriarchal system. In Sweden, we have had a population growth in the 19th century that made the rulers see that the economy can't follow the population. And then they introduced this school for both men and boys and girls in 1842. And there were professional for pregnancy and so on. So somehow Sweden took a responsibility for the relation between the economy and the population. And when we had the big immigration, it was to land. We got land from the Indians, from the native Indians, that didn't, because they didn't own land. And the fight for territory has followed the human being, and it is complicated. I feel so much in Sweden now that land and the private property is never discussed. 15% only of the land in the land in Sweden is public. So this whole question is the ones that came to Earth first could buy up 90% of the Earth land, and then the rest should be on the other part. The question of territory and the possibility to have sustainable agriculture, it should be discussed without this inflammation that somebody says. I will end, but I tried to make a seminar in ABF 2009 about the climate issue and reproductive health, and from the university, there was a professor, and he said, "Oh no, it's our consumption. It's only our consumption," and yet they don't do anything about that consumption. But anyhow, it became a good seminar. But I would say that this Cairo Declaration, we, as well as to this environmental fund of 100 billions, there was a promise to really put money, I think it was 12 billions or something, into reproductive health. And no one of the rich countries lived up to it. And this will, it seems sometimes that it's in support of the people, but it's in neglecting the women and the girls. I mean, now in South, so I can't. I think Mattias Wackenargel, with his footprint, ecological footprint, he said anyhow that giving women money, they will take care of the community and the family, and they don't want to have these 10 children or 6 children. Still in Africa, they will reach the 2.7 children first in 2070. And I don't think that it's the wish of the women. But it seems in this polarization that it's either you take the part of the one or the other. And if you put the population, it seems that you are not questioning the rich consumption, but you could do both. Yeah.
But that was a good final point there. I suppose now we ought to wind up, but and actually we should do it immediately. But I propose that we at least give those who have been speaking a possibility to say something. But I also see a new person have arrived, maybe one more from the UK who haven't missed the time zone, that it was Central European time. If you want, you could present yourself. I can suppose that we are so few that we can run over, or what it is said in English, some minutes. Is that okay? And I can't see the name because, yeah. I propose then that we give a final word to the speakers and then I sum it up. So Lars can begin. He has his hand up already.
Yes, I think it's very important what Maria said at the end here. We don't need to choose population policy or reducing inequalities or fighting climate change or so. We can do several things at the same time. I've been working part-time, of course, but several years in Ethiopia and Uganda. And I don't think it's a good thing for those countries to have a rapid growth of population. And population increase is a problem not only for climate change related things, but also for biodiversity and resource use. So I think we don't need to polarize this issue. We need to try to accept solutions in several parts of the world. So I think we should end rather soon, so I'll stop here. But I have a lot more to say, but not today.
Hey, Ellie.
All right, I think I would like to go back to Peter's original thoughts about environment and peace, and that is to keep focus on environmental damages and problems creating new conflicts, war, and the contribution to environmental pollution and CO2 emissions of big armies, many times larger than countries, especially countries in the south. And then also the new geopolitical trends that we see. How can we create more awareness about these issues? I don't have a real solution other than movement cooperation and trying to increase our impact, make more people aware of the issues. But I think it's a good opportunity for the movements to be more interconnected. And maybe a small step forward could be to organize more webinars like this. That would maybe be a small step for us as well. That would bring us a little bit forward. Thanks.
Okay, Peter.
Yeah, very briefly, social movements occur if there is a problem, and if the problem is getting bigger and bigger, the social movements used to get also bigger and powerful. The problem that we have had as a peace movement was that after the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, there was an impression that there was no more a problem of peace and war, that the problem would have been settled and solved. This is one of the reasons why younger people are not aware, are not committing to this issue. I do not criticize them for that. For them, even the peace movement, which was very strong in Western Europe in the 70s, 80s, is as far away as, for me, World War I, for example. It's history, and we have to cope with that. But on the other hand, I see that the increasing tension, the unfortunate emergence of a new Cold War, and that's dialectics, will also promote and further resistance and movements against. I have the impression, and I have some empirical evidence, that here and there this process has already started. Of course, I cannot predict how it will work in the end, but I would predict that in the next years there will be emerging more and more people who are understanding that peace and war is an issue they have to deal with. And what we can do as movement, as activists, as intellectual, as a kind of infrastructure for such movement, is to check whether our arguments, our strategies are still valid. My feeling is some of them look a bit old-fashioned, and there are new issues that we have not yet taken up. What we have to do is to reconsider our positions and our strategies, and in particular to deal with complexity. Things are more complex and complicated today in a globalized world than it was 50 years ago or even 150 years ago. So this is what we can do as activists in the movement. And I think discussions like these are little contributions to it. And I'm confident and optimistic that there will be more in the next years. Thank you for your participation and your contributions.
And then as a final word, I really especially appreciate the interventions here from Maria in Scotland, because I think that is really what contributes the richness. And makes us much more capable of addressing that complexity that Peter talks about. I tried to answer in a maybe complex way by claiming that the polarization is not so big in the movement as it is in the periphery, who are more dominated by academic discussions or mass media and so on. And I think that it's important that we see this difference, that we don't get too much occupied by mass media, for instance. I'm a little bit known for saying that I give a total damn shit about mass media. The reason is very simple, is that the best mass media that exists in the world are actually the connection between movements. That's where we can build a kind of awareness that in the final end will end up in mass media. And this happens to me regularly. There's no problem getting into bigger mass media, actually, if you maintain your integrity. If you don't lose you in these words, which I think is so much more horrendous than when I was a young activist. When I was a young activist, it was fully possible in Sweden, in Stockholm. You had free, it was free to rent localities. If you were a movement, you didn't need to pay the rent. Today, it costs you a fortune. You could get funding by organizing a so-called study circle, and you choose the theme yourself. Today you get enormous amount if you follow the agenda of the donors. And for the rest, you are left in a very, very expensive world if you want to get out, and or a social media where you are left in a corner, sort of. So, but these are the realities. I think we are a lot stronger than we believe. And I met some people from Attac in Hungary, where I go regularly, because I think Eastern Europe is really more interesting than Western Europe, and the Italians were there as well. And they talked about the Care Society. They had a network with some 400 organizations, small, they said, and they were not significant, etc. I think it is significant. It's exactly the kind of way of addressing patriarchy, where you put care and what is in some very odd language called reproduction at the center of our thinking. These are really the ways out of this consumerist society when we start to focus on caring about ourselves, etc. So I think there are ways. It's also the need to avoid only talking about distribution of wealth, because we have to look at how wealth is produced. And there's an extreme difference between the rural realities and urban realities. And this we did organize at the World Social Forum according to rural issues and urban issues. And it worked very well. You get much more closer to people in common than realities, because people are really in their daily life very much focused in these realities, who are very different, because agriculture and forestry and fisheries are working under complete different conditions than industry and service industries. So we have to be closer to people in common, and we were in the 70s. We addressed the conditions at the workplace, for instance. We never do it more, the environmental movement anymore. And this loses our connection to the daily struggles of people. So I think it's possible to not make it so complex. It's possible to claim that we have to oppose this privatization on all levels, whether it's local, national, or NATO together with EU that wants to shape the world according to the interest of corporate interest. We can do this. And I'm really grateful that lot of participating in the discussions. And we will try, we have been recording this. We will try to distribute it, and we will try to do educational material, only short things, and hopefully some other material as well. to develop this further. So thank you very much, the speakers and all of you who participated. I was very worried about this because I had some problems with a little bit of everything, but now I'm so happy. So thank you, everyone, and good luck to all of you for the rest of this.
Jättebra.
Ciao, ciao. And Connie, thank you for the technical things.
Yeah. Thank you.